Step right up, step right up. Who wants to win a prize? Who wants to be Dead Money's first lucky winner? Step right up, step right up. Alright, you know what? Fuck this. This is stupid. I got a better idea. Hello everyone, welcome back to Dead Money. I think I'll give you a little progress update so far. I must say that the therapy to this point is working. Just coming on here, doing the show, walking around each day, I seem to feel a little better each one. So, good job to all of you as my silent therapists, and thank you as well for allowing me to continue to do this by not murdering me. Now, you might be able to tell just by listening, but I'm slightly under the weather as I deliver you this episode. I got a little creative the other night. I was in a motel room with like 15 porno stars. Now, they're all females. We were all fucking. But then one of them sneezed all over my prick. Now, thankfully I was wearing a prophylactic, so this wasn't as bad as it could have been, but that is how this happened. Now, in case you're wondering how I even knew these people, well, you may remember the backlog of the 200,000 or so emails I mentioned in episode 1. You know, and all the hot women that were begging me to restart the show, many of which who sent me nudes. Well, I stayed in touch with one of them. Orange Sherbert is what she calls herself, and she told me she was in town this weekend with some friends to play some mini golf, so I said, let's meet up after you're done so we can all hang out and talk, and as they say, the rest is history. But anyway, okay, so today I'm just gonna go over the highlights of some recent hand histories. I said they would all be from this past week, and most of them will be, but some are gonna go a little further back than that. But before I start, I must point out that for the most part, people have actually been behaving themselves better lately. And the only plausible explanation I have for that is everyone and their mother are talking about the Dead Money podcast. So people are surely trying to get their act together, and especially when they see me come in the room.
Wow.
So it's very refreshing to know that this was all being done because of me. Anyway, so here we go, hand number 1. So these first 2 hands are actually not from the Wynn 2.5, but from a weekly flavorful game that's been running on Sunday nights lately at Resorts World. The game is 2-3, but it's a deep stack buy-in. It's $600 to sit down, and there's no maximum. It's a time rate game. You can shadow any amount from any position. There are dealer's choice bomb pots on every dealer change, although I usually sit those out. If you win a pot without going to showdown, you have to show one of your hull cards, although I've been quite forgetful about that. But it's been no big deal. It's a chill game. So when I have forgotten to show a card, I just told the table what one of my 2 cards were. But the most flavorful quirk to this game is something called the Small Blind Bounty, which I'd never seen anywhere else, so let me explain how that works. So when the game begins, whoever has the button places a $5 chip on top of the button, and that $5 represents the Small Blind Bounty. Now this $5 is not part of the pot for anyone except the small blind. If the small blind wins the pot, they collect the bounty. If the small blind does not win the pot, then after you move the button, the next player who now has the button places another $5 chip on the button. So now the small blind bounty is $10. 5 plus 5 is 10. Now, since winning a pot out of the small blind is theoretically the most difficult spot to win a pot from, you can easily go 10 to 15 hands in a row or more without the small blind ever taking down a pot. And as this small blind bounty piles up higher and higher, it really opens the door to a lot of potentially crazy dynamics. Because if you've got your normal 2-3 blinds but a small blind bounty of, say, $85, the small blind has a ton of incentive to play their hand, whether it's calling a raise, 3-betting, or just bomb raising themselves if no one has opened the pot before them. And if the small blind 3-bets when the bounty is really high, That, of course, invites the opportunity for the open raiser to 4-bet bluff. It's the sort of dynamic that, depending on who's in the game, can make the game insane. It sort of takes on the element of the 7-deuce game, because if the small blind bounty is really high, and it's your small blind, yes, of course you want to try and win it, but at the same time, how badly do you want to risk getting your throat cut in the process? Do you really want to stack off $1,000 playing a hand you would have otherwise never fucked with, all because you wanted the extra $80? So it's just another neat little quirk that's part of the direction poker has been trending in for a while now. So many people just aren't satisfied with a 2-blind game anymore. I still am. And in my day, when I consistently played higher, we had a small blind, a big blind, we all paid our own time individually every half hour, and that was it. Nobody complained. But we're in a new era of poker now, and there seems to be this constant demand for extra elements. Now, I'm fine with the special rules for this 2-3 deep stack game because it's made clear what the game is going to be like before you sit down, so everyone who is playing wants to play with these rules. But it's not like that in the other public games. And with all the controversy that's really picked up the last year or two with people, trying to bully others into straddling and insisting on some type of bomb pot on dealer changes or the stand-up game, or the 7-deuce game, which has been around for a while, but all those things, there's a constant need now, and it's turned into this entitled demand for additional elements. And they're all built on the same foundation, and that is, let's get the money in as fast and as often as possible. That's what seems to be what everyone wants now, whether they realize that's the reason or not. And it makes sense, because it's consistent with what the world seems to be more and more like every day now, and that is getting instant gratification. So more and more people are insisting on either winning big and going home, or just going home. But there is a lot of nastiness and entitlement surrounding it. Last year I was playing just a normal rules 2-5 game at Resorts World, and Resorts lets you do a bomb pot on the dealer change, so they did that, but then this one guy is like, hey, let's do another one. And a bunch of people wanted to do it, but I was like, no, you guys had your bomb pot, that's it. I wasn't trying to be an asshole about it. I was just saying, can we not do another bomb pot? I mean, we just played one, and by rule, we're only supposed to do one. But then I was like being antagonized for taking this position, as if I'm supposed to just be there to watch everyone else do what they want, as if this is their game, and I have no entitlement to just play the game that I signed up to play. So, maybe I'll buy into a bomb pot game and demand we play 1 to 2 regular hands of ordinary no-limit hold'em on every dealer change and see how they fucking like it. You see, it's not the extra 2 to 3 minute wait that I was fighting against. I mean, that would be the easy rationale to simply bending over to be the cool, people-pleasing yes man, but those days are over for me, because where did they ever get me? So what I'm fighting against is the expectation that I'm supposed to just comply with this request because this person decided it's not a big deal. Now, if this person wasn't entitled, he would have asked if any of us would mind if they played another bomb pot, but if he got any resistance, he would have just said, okay, and that would have been it. And in thinking about this story again, now I'm wondering, is it me, or are there more and more people now who are like these wannabe whales and think that everyone is supposed to just do what they want, whenever they want, like they're this once-in-a-lifetime VIP? Now look, I know there are times when it's in my best interest to just keep the whale happy, but those instances are few and far between, and especially at 2-5. They're almost non-existent. But it seems to be like there's more and more people acting like they're much bigger fish than they really are, so the next time something like this happens, I'm going to at least be tempted to say, sorry buddy, you're a fish, but you ain't that big of a fish. You know, I'm not about to go lose $655 at blackjack and then get mad at the hotel when they don't cop me a free villa with a vagina-shaped jacuzzi, since that'd be my only actual shot at even getting close to a vagina, never mind inside one. If you think I'm being too over the top about this, I mean, okay, but you know something? You won't catch me dead expecting anybody to do me a favor when I'm playing poker. But anyway, that's enough of that. So this first hand is from a couple weeks ago. The small blind bounty was pretty high. It was probably close to $100, maybe even more. My starting hand stunk. It was ace-ace. I'd been opening to 15 all night, and I stuck with that size, but I'm pretty sure that the bigger the bounty is, the larger you're supposed to open, since the small blind will want to call more and probably 3-bet more. But it also depends at least a little bit which player is in the small blind, since some players are going to be deeper than others, and just as importantly, some players are going to be more willing to die to win the small blind bounty than others. In any event, I made a 15, I had one call to my left, and the small blind called, so we go 3 ways. The flop was 9-6 ace rainbow, so I still have a shot at winning this. The small blind checks, and oftentimes I check the flop multi-way, especially with this hand when I block a ton of hands that will want to call, but I don't know. I didn't want to check this time. We spend all fucking day folding and checking, and sometimes you just want to bet, so can I do that? So okay. I spit on the pot and bet $10, and both players called. Now, I must say that at this point, I was already asleep at the wheel. They say ignorance is bliss, but I think in this case, ignorance was just ignorance. My eyes were heavy, and whenever I play under this fatigue, I always seem to really fuck up something, and this was a pretty significant oversight because I somehow wasn't considering that because the bounty was so high, that the small blind will, or at least should be calling much wider, because for him the bet isn't $10 into $48. It is for the other player, but for the small blind specifically, it's more like $148. So the dynamics of this small blind bounty are really something once it gets to be a big number, because one guy is getting one price to call, and the other one is getting a completely different price. So how do you juggle this, no matter what you have? Do you overbet and go huge in case the small blind has something? Maybe. I don't know. I do know that betting big is going to look really strong because you and the others only stand to win what's in the pot, and that if anyone besides the small blind continues, then their hand should be pretty strong. But if the small blind has pure trash, he's going to fold pretty much to any bet, and if you go too big, you might scare off everyone else if you have something, so I don't think there's a clear answer. Now, if your head's up against a small blind, that simplifies things, but that wasn't the case for this hand, so whatever, they both call, and now the turn comes to queen. It checks to me again, and now I bet $40. The other player folds, and the small blind calls again. But he's not calling $40 bet into a pot that's $118 like it is for me. Now it's more like $218. The river comes another queen, so I've got aces full, and he checks again. Now this player had been really nitty to this point. Not just from the fact that he wasn't playing that many hands, he just seemed nitty. You know, a player being inactive for an hour or two doesn't really tell you anything because the sample is so tiny, but every player is giving off energy, and this guy was putting out that he's nitty. Now, if this game had either no small blind bounty or at least a very low bounty for this hand, then there's basically no scenario where the small blind could ever have trip queens. The flop was ace-9-6 rainbow, so he's not going to have queen-jack, queen-10, king-queen, queen anything really. But those hands are now likelier because when he called $10 on the flop, he's not getting 7-1 odds. He's getting like 17-1. Now, that doesn't mean I should expect him to have a queen, but there's definitely a chance of it. Anyway, so at the river, this pot has about $160 in it for me, but for the small blind, it's about $260, and that's what I should be thinking about. I thought about firing an overbet of like at least $400, maybe even $500, because I thought this guy might not call any bet unless he has a queen. And if that's true, then I should just go massive. And I came pretty damn close to doing it because if he has a queen, nitty or not, I don't think he's going to fold, even though his hand now probably beats nothing except bluffs. But then I thought, well, if he had a queen, he might just bet the river into me himself. And then I thought if I don't go big and he has a queen, then he'll probably just check raise me anyway, because he should never have a queen. So I figured there's no need to overbet because I'll get significant action from Queen X either way. But because I was asleep at the wheel and not thinking about how he was the small blind and the bounty was really high, I thought he probably just has ace X, so I'm not going to bet big because I want to make sure I get called by that. So I bet 65, which for him was only a quarter of the pot. He snap calls, and after I show aces full, now he shows he did have a queen with queen jack off.
Oh, fuck.
And, oh my god, was that tilting for so many reasons. First of all, I came very close to checking the flop. I don't think I should have in that case, but if I did, then I would have thought him having a queen is far more likely because he wouldn't have had to call a flop bet. So that alone, right there, is just some hidden variance. We all know about the variance that comes with what cards run out, but there's so much variance with just decision making. And it's brutal when you're 99% about to choose X, but instead you change your mind and choose Y. And choosing Y wasn't necessarily a bad idea, but when things aren't going your way, every close decision you make fucks you as hard as possible. Now, I still can't believe he didn't either check raise the river or just lead the river himself with that hand, but that's another thing I fucked up because I should have remembered that since nitty players don't raise on the river pretty much with anything except the nuts, then I can't count on him to raise trip queens even if I bet small. If I had ace-jack or ace-10, this would have had the same result as long as I chose to bet the flop. I'd have 100% bet the turn and the river and just been called by a better hand. You can call it unlucky that he didn't raise the river or just bet into me himself, but I'll be saying this a lot, you make your own luck. So at the end of the day, I did this one to myself, and if I wasn't asleep at the wheel and realized he can call the flop a million times wider because of how big the bounty is, then I probably would have just nuked the river hoping he does somehow have a queen. So I was back at this game from this past Sunday the 2nd, and once again the small blind was really high. It looked to be over $100. A few players limped in for $3, and I had queen jack off in the small blind. This is an interesting spot because my hand is like just good enough to consider raising big, but just bad enough that it'll still be difficult to navigate post-flop, especially if it goes multi-way. So I don't really know what I should do here, and I guess that's also part of why people like games now that feature all of these additional elements. I don't think just calling the big blind and playing the pot 6 or 7 ways, assuming the big blind checks, is the worst idea, but I didn't want to do that. So the question is, how big should I go? And I don't know that either. Because when the bounty gets really high, the game tends to get a lot stickier pre-flop. They don't want to just let the small blind take the bounty down without a fight because they're hoping that they can still win it later. So they're going to defend much wider. But for as big as I might want to go, I still have the big blind behind me, and there's always some chance he wakes up with a big hand, so I can't go too big. But if I only go pretty big, I'm still going to have a hard time navigating this because I have to figure it's going to go multi-way. So you see how complicated this small blind bounty can make things. I decided on $55, and it didn't work out that great. A few players folded, but I still had to go 4 ways. The flop came 8-5-4, 2 spades, and I had a spade. I think it was the jack. And at this point, I'm not going to continue with the ambition. I'm not necessarily giving up. I just don't want to barrel this hand into 3 other players. I think checking will tell me more about their ranges, so I check, the next 2 guys check, and the imposition player bets 75, which was only about 30% pot for everyone else. Now this guy was very fishy, and when he bets this small into 3 players on this flop, his hand is rarely anything big. Otherwise, he'd have just bet substantially bigger, even with just top pair. Now, it didn't cross my mind, but because of all this, I think check raising big here is a pretty solid move because no one else would have checked a big hand once I checked as the initial raiser, and the guy who did bet went pretty small. So it's pretty clear that no one really has anything worth getting excited over. But I think I was just nervous about stacking off here because I was paranoid they were going to think I'm just going ham to win the bounty, even though if I did have a big hand like an overpair, I'd have very likely played it the exact same way. But what I ended up thinking was, given the pot size plus the bounty, I was getting well over 5-1 to call and see the turn, and there's a bunch of turn cards that can help me out somehow, and since I wasn't worried about anyone else check raising, I just decided, okay, fine, I'll peel one more. Still think check raising is the better play, though. Anyway, one other player called and the other folded. The turn was another 5, and we all checked. The river was another 4, and it was a 3rd spade, so flushes are possible, but now the board has double paired. The pot for everyone else has about 450, but for me, it's about 550 or 570. And then I went into the tank for a little bit. The other player who had overcalled the flop was also very fishy, and at this point I had ruled out that no one would have either an 8 or a 5. I think the middle position player would have bet the flop with an 8, and I think the in-position player would have bet bigger on the flop if he had an 8. And I think if either player had a 5, I think they'd have just bet the turn, no doubt. But neither did, so I ruled that out as well. Someone could have a 4, though, and definitely either one. I suppose either one could have had a flush, too, so I was glad that I at least had a spade to block flushes. The flush obviously isn't in a good spot here with the board double pairing, but it's still the type of hand a fish could get sticky with. The middle position player looked to have about 900, and I had him covered. And the in-position player had about maybe 600, maybe less. So while I was in the tank, I was trying to figure out, do I give up or jam? And I was definitely getting tempted to jam. I was trying to get a read on both guys. And the middle position guy looked a little spacey at a couple different moments. And he's very loose, too, so I thought, all right. He probably just overcalled the flop with something really weak that went nowhere, so I didn't think I had to worry about him, but still got the other guy. I flashed him a momentary glance, and he was looking at me hard, and he looked a little anxious. And I think when people are staring you down at any point in the hand, that it's usually a sign of weakness because more often than not, they're just trying to slow you down from betting. There have been times where I could see a guy out of the corner of my eye looking at me, but whenever I bet into them, they usually just fold. So with all that in mind, I thought, okay, I don't think he wants me to do what I'm thinking about doing. Now, there is just one other problem, though, and that is it's really difficult for me to suddenly and credibly rep a value range by jamming. Because if I jam, I'm saying I have a full house. I'm saying I have a 5 or a 4, but jamming makes no sense. I could have for sure had a 5 or 4 calling the flop, but if I had a 5, then I, like the other two, would have just come out betting the turn. And if I had a 4, jamming doesn't really make that much sense either, because what hand is going to call me? I would bet if I had a 4, but I wouldn't be betting that big. So this is why I was in the tank for not a crazy long deliberation, but I was thinking pretty hard about this one. I can't rep anything, but it really doesn't look like either player is going to hold on for a shove. And since neither player is any good, as I said in the last episode, your most outside-the-box maneuvers will be made against weaker players because they make so many huge mistakes and don't realize it when you're giving them something they can easily capitalize on. And let me just add to something else I said a moment ago. I told you how I flashed the guy a momentary glance. Well, oftentimes that's something I will do when I can remember to do it. When I'm really stuck for a decision, and that's usually in a heads-up scenario. If I'm not sure what to do, I'll just flash my opponent a glance, and whatever my first instinctive read is off that glance, that's if I even get a read, then that is what I'll decide on as the tipping point. So after some careful deliberation, I decided, fuck you guys, I'm pushing the little red button. So I went all in for about 2 times the pot against the middle position player, and it was probably a little over pot against the in-position player. The first guy folded right away, so okay, so far so good. That's what I thought was going to happen. Now the other guy starts thinking, and he's thinking, and he's tanking, and he's not sure. He's in pain, but I'm also in pain because if he calls, I'm about to lose my ass trying to chase down this stupid small blind bounty, and it's happened before. The first time I played this game was a couple of years ago when it was at the Sahara, but this guy was in enough pain that I didn't think he was going to call, but you never know. So I'm waiting this out. I know I'm holding a pretty good face, although it didn't really seem like he was trying to get a read on me. Then he tanks on a little longer, and he folds.
Phew.
I had to show one card, but this time I decided to show both, just because I thought for so long. And you know what he folded? It wasn't a flush. This was unfucking believable. He had a 4.
No.
He folded a 4 in that spot, and he wasn't lying. And then the guy next to him started, lecturing him about what a bad fold that was, and then they started having this petty argument where they were both, trying to control the volume of their voice, but were still sticking it at each other. And this guy was defending his fold, which, if you know anything about poker, should realize is atrociously bad. All he loses to is a 5, and I probably don't have one. But even if I somehow do, then alright, you just gotta live and die with that. You know, most of the time the blunders fish make that you can't even believe comes by way of putting money into the pot, but sometimes they do it by letting their hand go. Now, I know I was very lucky he folded that hand, but once again, you make your own luck because I had the read on him that he was nervous, and I was right. Now, he should never, ever, 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 ever be nervous with the hand he was holding. He should be pumping his fist, but he wasn't. And I picked up on his nerves from that little glance and was rewarded for doing so. I said a couple times earlier that I think I should have just check-raised the flop, and after giving away that opportunity, I still didn't get a run out that was any good, but I managed to find a way through it with some live reads, and whether you like it or not, live reads go a long way in poker. But the thing is, just because he looked nervous doesn't mean he was guaranteed to fold. Sometimes players don't look anxious about what you're going to do because they're playing to fold. They're just anxious about what it is they think they're about to lose. So on another day, he may have called. But if he did on this day, it's a really bad beat for me that would be exceptionally tilting, because how are you nervous about losing with that hand? I mean, if there's no better reason for him to call, I can have a 4-2, so at the very least he can still split the pot and get a lot more money back than just his, since there was a fair amount of dead money in the pot. So how does he fold that? How does he fold that?
Why?
I mean, he's up there with the bases loaded, he's got a full count, he gets a fastball right down the fucking pipe, and he just stands there and he takes it. I mean, alright, thanks. So, enjoy it with me, people. And don't ever forget how much losing fish incur. It's easy to get caught up when they're luckboxing you all day, but they're the biggest reason you win. Because they just give it to you, one way or another. So, there would have just been some more hidden variance had he called and nit-rolled me with a 4. You know, something I've been thinking about more and more these last few weeks is that bad bluffs work at 2-5. Now, technically this isn't a 2-5 game, but it plays to the size of one, and this bluff I ran, this is not a good play, okay? It took exceptional circumstances for me to even consider it, but this is what makes the fish so fishy. Because you can beat them so many different ways. Now, in this case, the difference was with a read, but when you throw in also just how many terrible spots they constantly put themselves in, it's all there for you to exploit it. Anyway, so, okay, here are some hands now played under traditional rules. This first one was from January 15th. I popped up early one morning, so I went down to the Wynn to catch the remains of the overnight game. I'd been there about a half hour. I hadn't really done anything yet. And then comes an early position raise to 15. There was one call, and I made it 65 on the button with ace-10 off. The small blind cold called. The other two folded, so we go heads up, and we're 1,500 deep. I 3-bet a lot of hands pre-flop, especially when there's at least one flatter. I do this for a few reasons. Number one, if you can take down the pot pre and save on the rake, that's great. Number two, people 4-bet bluff very little in comparison to how wide they open, so most often they either just fold or call. Number three, when they do call, most of the time they're just trying to make the nuts, so they call down light very rarely, and they bluff very rarely, so all things considered, it's just an open invitation to get run over. And it's really a huge leak in the way so many players play, winning regs included. Because being out of position to the 3-better and just checking and guessing most of the time is not going to end well often enough to even consider doing it. So that's why I strongly advocate a wide 3-betting range in the 2-5 field, because the player pool responds very poorly to it. But now I'm in a peculiar situation because the small blind cold called the 3-bet. And though cold calls of 3-bets at 2-5, though a little awkward to deal with, are also no rarity because you see it every day. The flop comes 9-8 deuce rainbow and he checks. The pot has 160, and I'm afraid I did not write down what sizes I used this whole hand. I do know that none of them were unusual in any kind of way, so let's just assume I went from somewhere between 90 and 105, which he called, as I expected. At this point, I think this is just going to be a lot of medium pocket pairs, but everyone is still pretty new to me. So all I know about this guy is he's Filipino, and he appears to be having a big night since he had a lot of chips. The turn is another 8 and it's a heart, so now there's 2 hearts, and he checks again. Pot is around 350. And I know my bet size here was definitely on the bigger side. I know it was over 300, and he called that as well. The river is a 6, and he checks one last time. And at no point did I ever sense any sort of, real confidence from the guy, so I didn't think he's got a real big hand like queens or jacks. He could have tens, but I have a blocker to that, so he should be pretty marginal. But the pot is huge now, and I felt this way for years, that I would rather just bluff everything off than check down and lose to some bullshit hand that probably would have folded to one last barrel. So I stick it in and jam. It's got to be about 1,000, maybe a little less. I said I don't remember the exact sizes I picked, but I do think I remember wishing I'd bet a little smaller on the turn so that my river jam would be a little bigger. But in any event, he's thinking and thinking, and I'm feeling pretty good about this. I was kind of surprised when he called the turn, but I don't think he's going to call me now. I mean, sometimes when you're bluffing, you can really tell when the guy is moving in the direction of calling you, but I wasn't getting any of that from this guy. Then he asked, "Will you show if I fold?" And as soon as he asked that, I immediately defaulted to what I usually do when I'm in this situation. Years ago, I was playing 10-20 at the Bellagio, and another player was asked the same question, and he said to the guy, "If you show it you fold, then I will show you my hand." The other guy folded and showed what he was throwing away, and then he was shown a bluff. And I thought that was a really savvy tactic, so I started using it myself. Now, it's the sort of thing that only comes up every so often, so it's not like I do this every day, but every time I have resorted to this tactic, it has worked. They folded their hand and showed, and then I showed them the bluff. So I was really glad he asked me that, because to this point, it had never failed. So I'm still feeling really good about this, but then he says something like, sighing, "Oh, I guess I deserve it." Now I'm thinking, oh no. This is suddenly not looking so good. And next thing you know, he's pushing in a big stack of chips. He's calling. Okay, so I just turned my hand over. Still have to act professional. And pro players or not, I don't think there's anything that gets people to act like bigger babies than when they bluff and lose. How many times have you called a guy bluffing only to have him be some pissy sap refusing to turn his hand over until you all but ram a chainsaw down his throat? If I catch a fish bluffing, more often than not, I'll give him a break and just turn my hand over. But if it's a reg, or squeaky, or anyone else I don't like, no, absolutely not. Either show your hand or muck it. That's all. I'm not insisting I see your hand. I'm insisting you either show or muck because it's your action. I know players don't want to show their hand if they don't have to, and neither do I. But it's not bad etiquette for me to call someone, hear them say good call, and then wait for them to show or muck. So I don't care what anyone says, including all of the macho old school guys who think they were born with a monopoly on the truth. You can be old school and still be a huge baby. It's not just one or the other. And every time I see a reg lose a bluff, and he just turns his cards over like a grown man, I remember that because he was respectful. There's only so many players who are. So the next time your bluff goes down, either show it or muck it, or you're not coming to my next birthday party. So alright, so I show my airball minus the soap opera, and he turns over the winner with pocket fives. Okay. It of course felt pretty shitty to get myself buried this early, but this was a pretty rare disaster to have happen. I just got through telling you how it's rare to see people call down light, and it is. And if you just want to go by the combinatrix, yeah, I mean, I should have more bluffs with ace-king and ace-queen and those kinds of hands than value hands like aces, kings, queens, maybe jacks. But people tend to fold the type of hand he had at some point for two reasons. One, they don't want to stack off light because they'll feel too stupid. And two, they're too concerned that people aren't going to bluff in this situation often enough. Now, if I had been in the game for a couple hours and had still been fairly inactive, maybe this bluff works. But because I was still new and I don't know him and he doesn't know me, then maybe that was the tipping point. As far as his play of the hand goes, well, look, I mean, it worked out quite nicely for him this time, so he gets to look like a genius, but it's pretty bad. With the 3-bet in front of him, he should just fold the pocket fives, because it's hard to flop sets, it's hard to get value out of position since it's hard playing out of position, period. It's like night and day compared to being in position. And above all else, there's just way too many post-flop scenarios that are going to put him in the same predicament where he's facing a lot of heat and now he's just going to be guessing. And guessing is not the way you win, because the more often you're guessing, the more often you're going to be wrong. You want to be in spots where you feel like your decision is relatively close to clear. Now, apart from just combinatrix, I don't know why he called. I've said to a lot of people over the years that sometimes they just call, and that there's no rhyme or reason, there's no in-depth explanation, they just didn't want to fold. So that's sort of the problem with bluffing. People don't like to fold. How many times have you heard that profound statement? I don't like to fold. Oh, really? That's so deep. So I don't know. Maybe he was just having a big night and figured to hell with it. Why not? That could be a reason. If so, that's not a good reason. Other reasons in other situations could be the guy is having a really bad night. He's getting beat up left and right, and now he finds himself again in a spot where he thinks he should fold, but this time he just gets stubborn and doesn't want to. He puts the money in tilting and thinking the guy probably has him again, but this time, hey, look what I found. He's bluffing. And when that happens, it's just hidden variance again and a lucky call. It's only a good call if you feel you either had a strong read or if you sized up the situation strategically and decided it's worth it. Not just lazily tossing the money and feeling sorry for yourself, looking to see if your bad luck has occurred yet again so you can complain about it. So I've stacked off here. I'm pretty tilted about it, but I'm biting my tongue. I wanted to, but I'm not going to say anything to belittle the other guy's play. I'm just going to move on. But then the guy next to me started making some comments, and I didn't respond to them because he wasn't saying them directly to me, and I don't think he was even trying to needle me. But I still could have said something because I can clearly hear him. After the hand was over, this guy, who was young, he said like 3 or 4 times, "The speech fucked it up. The speech fucked it up." So he felt that my bluff would have worked if I had just kept quiet rather than tell the guy I'd show him my hand if he showed me what he was folding. Well, as I said earlier, this tactic had worked every other time I tried it, and he obviously wouldn't know that, but either way, I was pretty irritated hearing him say this, because it's just like, okay, I just got stacked in a $3,000 pot by a super rare hero call, but now I have to listen to another player who wasn't even involved in this dilemma give commentary as to why my play didn't work. I don't need to be coddled by anybody, but this is a gentleman's game, so when people lose, just give them some grace and just shut the fuck up, alright? It's not hard. You don't know why he called. And I would never say anything like that right after a player got heroed because, if for no better reason, how the fuck would I know which way that little speech steered him, and that's if it even steered him at all? But whatever, I tried. That's all that matters, right? So now we fast forward another week or two. I was playing a long night session that went to about 3:30 in the morning. I mentioned before how I've been playing mostly in the daytime these last bunch of years, showing up either late morning or early afternoon with the occasional night game or overnight game. But these last 3 months, I'd say, have gotten to be really boring and quite consistently. And it was concerning because November and December are 2 of the best months to play. But day after day after day, I'm showing up and thinking, this is what I rushed over to the casino for? Within 20 minutes, I'm already thinking about how I wish I had just stayed home all day and kept a dildo in my mouth. Yeah! Now look, I've always known that poker is better at night just in general. Once the sun goes down, forget about it. People just behave differently. They basically turn into fucking werewolves. They drink more, and they may have already had a bad day, and now they're coming to take it out on the poker table. You know, maybe they got killed at sports betting, or better yet, maybe they got into a fight with their girlfriend. That's what you're really hoping for more than anything else, because if you're having girl problems, then the last thing you should ever do is play poker. So the expected value, the EV of playing a night, is a little higher, but the gap between the EV from the day games and the night games is always small enough that I didn't care because I liked playing in the daytime. But now that this gap has increased too widely and too frequently for too long, I've decided to switch things up for at least the time being. Anyway, so this Lebanese guy was in the game. He was in his 50s or 60s. He was good action. He was exactly the type of player I've been seeing very little of in the day games the last few months. He joined the game with about 500 or 600, but now he was on a heater when this hand started. He probably had about 3,000. At this point, I too had been having a good game since I had about 2,500 when the hand started, and I had aces. So I make it 20. One guy calls from the middle position, and he also looked fishy, and Mr. Lebanon called from the button. Flop came Jack 4 deuce, 2 diamonds, and I had a diamond. Betting might make more sense than checking because even though he was action, he was skewed slightly toward the passive side, so there might be hands that he would check back but would still call a bet. But either way, I still think checking will perform well. People get fooled by this type of line all the time. So the next guy checks and Lebanon bets 50. It's a big size compared to the pot, but the pot is also only $60, so I raise to 185, expecting to get called by any draw he might have, or if he has a jack. When players are drawing, they tend to call relatively fast because they know they're not going anywhere, so when he was thinking, I figured he's thinking about calling or re-raising. I sure hope he doesn't re-raise, but if he does, I'll just fold. But he was just acting weird because he was getting loud. He was asking, "How much is it?" Like more than once. It didn't seem like there was any chance he was going to fold, but I didn't know what was going on. All I decided was I'm not going to worry about it against someone like him. So he calls. Now the pot is up to 430. The turn is the 10 of clubs, so now there's 2 flush draws. So now I bet 330. And then we kind of went through the same spiel. He's looking at the bet, he's looking at his chips, and then he asks, "What is it?" The dealer tells him again, it's 330. He continues to gyrate a little, and he calls. Once again, I was folding if he raised. The river came another 10, but both flushes missed. As I said, I thought he didn't have a flush draw, so I think I feel safe. He's been acting weird this whole hand, but I didn't want to read into that and level myself into doing something passive, so let's just bet again and hope he doesn't raise. I go 675, he calls me like a shot. I turn my hand over, and then he shows me the winner with pocket 4s for a full house. It was a pretty passive call he made on the river by not raising, but either way, this was pretty unnerving. And some more hidden variance. There was nothing wrong with the way he played the hand, it was just unusual to see. Because a huge portion of the player pool will either re-raise me on the flop after I check raise, or, at the very least, they would at least raise that specific turn card, with there being so many different draws present. That's just what tends to go on. And had he done so, he'd have won a whole lot less. So the line he took ended up being perfect, but that's not the point. The point is, this doesn't happen that much, but it did explain all his antics on the flop and turn. The guy had a huge hand. I don't regret anything, the guy had been super loose. He limp called a big raise from under the gun with king deuce offsuit, so it's not like when he bets the flop, he can't have a whole slew of hands that I'm well ahead of. But his heater would continue on, and after losing that pot, I could barely play a hand for the next 2 hours. Meanwhile, this guy can't lose. But then he said something I'd never heard before. He said, "I want them to have aces," because of that hand versus me. And when all his buddies came by the table, he was telling them about that hand. Now, I want my opponents to have aces too, but that's only after my hand can beat a pair of aces. I don't want the hand starting out that way. But this is what happens when people run good. They feel invincible. I finally did win a hand against him. It wasn't very big. Someone opened to 25, and I made it 75, and he called the small blind. So we go 3 ways, and I got a dream flop. It came ace, 8, 6, 2 hearts. And we all checked. I was in position. The turn was a 10. They both checked again, and I bet 125. Lebanon called, and the other guy folded. The river was a 5. He checks again. I bet something kind of small, I think around 140, and he immediately show-folded his hand, which was queen-jack offsuit, so he turned a double gutter, which missed. But then he said to me, "You got lucky." I just said, "I know." And I did get lucky. Queen's going against queen-jack offsuit, and the queen's won. Doesn't get any luckier than that. So now we fast forward again to this past Saturday, February 1st. The hijack limped, the small blind opened to 25, and I defended the big blind with ace-5 of clubs, and we go 3 ways. The small blind is a reg. He used to play more, but now I just see him on occasion. He's a thinking player. He's not brilliant, but he's not bad. We have a fair amount of history together. The flop was Jack 4-7 rainbow, 1 club, so I have the backdoor draws. He bets 35, and I called, even with a player to act. Now, this might be a little spewy, I'm not sure, but I did it for 2 reasons. 1, the hijack isn't very good, and 2, because there's another player left, I thought my call would look less like a float and more like a real hand or draw. So, I just wanted to see the turn in case there was anything I could get creative with. But the turn was the king of spades, so now there's 2 spades. This card missed me completely, and it hits the small blind's range. He bets 95, and okay, mission aborted, I fold. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this hand is because the next orbit, I found myself in an almost identical spot. That same player limped, the rec reg opened to 20 from the hijack, and this time I called the button with a 7 of diamonds. I thought about 3-betting, but I left that alone this time, and we go 3 ways again. The flop is Queen 5-6 rainbow, and once again I have the backdoor draws. It goes check, the rec reg bets 30, and once again I float in position thinking this will not look like a float, and once again we go heads up to the turn. The turn was the 2 of diamonds, so now I did catch something helpful. I was thinking about raising if he bet again, but he bet kind of big. He went almost the pot size, betting 110, so I opted not to raise and just called instead. I bricked the river, but it was a 9, so 8-7 is now the new nut straight, and had been 4-3 after that turn card. But now he checked, and having the 7 blocker is obviously a nice card to have, but with or without it, I think the player pool's checking ranges on the river are very imbalanced. I think in a spot like this, if anyone had a big hand, they would just be betting it and then dealing with the raise if and when that happens. And by big hand, I guess I mean anything as strong as flopping a set or maybe even 2-pair with 6-5. So once he checks, I think he's probably capped at holding a 1-pair hand, whether it's a queen or an overpair. There's a very minor chance I have the best hand if he has, say, something like King 10 or King Jack of diamonds. But if he has something like 9-8, 9-7, or King 9 of diamonds, those hands now all beat me. But whatever he had, I wasn't thinking that I have too much showdown value, so I'm going to have to do something to win this pot, which is now up to 330. And I just decided, fuck him and fuck this table, and in fact, fuck everyone who plays poker that doesn't look for situations to overbet as often as they can, whether they have it or not. Overbetting is the essence of No Limit Hold'em, so I pushed the little red button again, and I jammed. And he had me covered, so my all-in was more than 4 times the pot. So the total bet was probably around 1,300, I don't know the exact number. And he quickly folded. Now, jamming may have been overkill and unnecessary. Betting 2 times the pot may have been just as effective and half as risky in case I'm terribly mistaken and he does have something that can call, but I was very sure I was going to win this pot no matter what huge size I picked because of 2 reasons. 1, there aren't a lot of hands I can have that are bluffs. Although the hand I did bluff with wasn't even the best hand to do it with, I'd be better off if I had like 7-6 or 6-5 because then I at least block sets in 2 pairs, but I don't want to be like a reverse nit and only bluff with the absolute best hands to do it with. And the second reason I did this was, I just wanted to send a message both to him and the table. Now most people probably thought, alright, whatever, he probably just had the nuts and that's fine. That's good. But when someone goes all in for more than 4 times the pot, you plant a seed with them that lets them know you might do that again, and if that makes them uncomfortable, then great. These last few months have had a lot of uphill battling, and a lot of the pots I've won, I've had to do so by bluffing. And I've also just been thinking that when we get to the river and they start checking, if you've been quiet for a little bit but now suddenly come out of nowhere with this nuclear bomb of a bet, it's very likely to totally brain fuck them into folding, which is how I got to start thinking about how bad bluffs may not be as bad as they seem. And I'm not going to let that highly unusual and highly stupid hero call by 5s a few weeks ago deter me from making moves like this again. You don't need a 100% success rate to make something worth it. Now, these situations were, of course, very different since the pocket 5s hand, I was only jamming 100% of the pot on the river, whereas this was over 400% of the pot. But the point is, in this pretty nitty day and age of poker, bluffing makes a lot of money. Now, this is pretty much the first time that I can remember using this big of a size. I mean, I go 1.5x pot or double the pot or even more than double the pot relatively often, but I haven't been going this big. And look, I don't want to get too cocky because this succeeded the first time. I don't want to get too carried away using unnecessarily large sizes since the more you risk losing, then naturally the more often you have to win. But I will continue to keep my eyes open for spots like these because the percentage of the pool of players who will both bet a big hand on the river at a very high frequency and call light on the river at a very low frequency is getting larger and larger. But alright, that'll be enough for today, everybody. Don't be afraid to pull the trigger because tons of players act all big and bad until you put them to a decision. We'll see you next time.